My name is Claire Whitaker, and the night my mother finally stopped looking down on me, 184 people were sitting inside a Boeing 737 over Utah, with no idea how close they were to dying. The autopilot had failed. The captain was unconscious. The aircraft was moving through the dark in a way no passenger jet was supposed to move, dipping one wing, correcting too hard, then dropping just enough to make every stomach in the cabin lift toward the throat. Drinks slid off tray tables. A child started crying somewhere behind row 12. Someone near the back began praying out loud. And I was asleep in seat 7C. Not resting, not dozing. Asleep in that deep, heavy way a body sleeps when it has been running on fumes for too many days and finally stops asking permission to shut down. My hoodie was pulled up. My headphones were hanging around my neck. My knees were angled toward the window. To everyone around me, I was just another tired woman on a late flight to Seattle. To my mother, sitting 2 rows ahead, I was even less than that. I was the daughter who had never become a doctor like Audrey, the daughter who had flown helicopters for a while, the daughter who, in her words, was still trying to find something stable. Then 2 Black Hawks appeared outside the windows, one on each side of our aircraft, their lights steady against the black sky. A military voice came through the emergency frequency, sharp enough to cut through panic. If Claire Whitaker is on that aircraft, wake her up. Wake Lantern up now. My mother heard it before I did. She heard the name she had never cared enough to ask about. And somewhere between her disbelief and the shaking hands of the flight attendant reaching for my shoulder, everything she thought she knew about me began to fall. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 40% right now, right? If that's true, type 7. If not, type 9. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. 6 hours before that radio call, my mother was standing beside me at Denver International Airport with one hand on the handle of her cream-colored carry-on and the other smoothing the collar of a cashmere sweater she had chosen for people who might notice. Marlene Whitaker always dressed for being recognized. Not famous recognized. Respectable recognized. The kind where another woman glanced at her shoes, her watch, her posture, and understood that she had raised her children properly. Or at least one of them. We were flying to Seattle because my older sister, Audrey, was being honored at a hospital fundraising dinner the next evening. Audrey was 38, a cardiologist, married to a surgeon, living outside Bellevue in a house with heated bathroom floors and a Christmas card family. My mother had carried the printed invitation in her purse for 3 weeks, taking it out the way some people take out photographs of newborns. She's giving the keynote, she told the gate agent, though the woman had only asked whether we wanted to check a bag. The gate agent smiled politely. My mother kept going. My daughter, Dr. Audrey Bell, cardiology, Seattle Presbyterian. I stood beside her in my faded Colorado State hoodie, holding a black backpack with one strap repaired twice with heavy thread. There was a thin scar across the inside of my left wrist, pale now, almost silver. My mother's eyes touched it once, and moved away. She never liked reminders of things that could not be framed, announced, or explained over brunch. When we boarded, she took seat 5D. I had 7C. She offered to switch with me in the tone people use when they hope you say no. I said no. By the time I shoved my backpack under the seat, she was already talking to the woman beside her, Ruth Calder, a retired school teacher from Boise with soft gray hair and a paperback novel folded open in her lap. Ruth had the kind of face that made strangers tell the truth. My mother did not tell the truth. She presented the version that made her comfortable. My oldest is the reason we're traveling, she said. Big hospital event. We're very proud. Ruth turned and smiled back at me. And you? I opened my mouth, but my mother answered first. Claire does consulting now. Aviation safety. Before that, she flew helicopters with the National Guard. We're hoping it turns into something with regular hours. There it was. Soft, polished, almost kind. The sentence she had been using for years to make my life smaller, without sounding cruel. Ruth looked at me longer than most people did. Flying helicopters sounds pretty steady when someone needs one. My mother gave a small laugh. Important work, of course. Just not the kind of life a mother sleeps well over. I looked out the window at the runway lights blurring through the glass. I did not tell Ruth about Oregon. I did not tell her about smoke so thick it turned noon into dusk, or 11 firefighters following my searchlight through a canyon because it was the only thing they could see. I did not tell her that the old lantern patch was folded inside the front pocket of my backpack, behind my passport, in a place my mother would never look. I just buckled my seatbelt. Then I pulled my hood up, leaned against the window, and let the engines carry me away from my mother's voice. I did not know that a few hours later, the same sky she thought had made me unstable would be the only reason any of us got home alive. The engines deepened, and the plane began its slow push away from the gate. My mother was still talking. I could hear pieces of it through the space between the seats, the way you hear a television playing in another room. Audrey's residency. Audrey's research grant. Audrey's husband, Daniel, who had such a steady hands in surgery. Each sentence was placed neatly in front of Ruth like silverware at a dinner table. Then my name came up again. Claire was always different, my mother said. Different. That was one of her safer words. She used it when stubborn sounded too harsh, when disappointing sounded too honest, when she wanted sympathy without admitting she was complaining. Ruth said something I could not hear over the engine noise. My mother sighed softly. She was bright. Very bright. But she never wanted the path that made sense. Audrey had a plan by 16. With Claire, we learned not to plan too far ahead. The plane turned toward the runway. Outside, the wing lights flashed against the dark glass. I kept my head against the window and watched the airport slide past in long streaks of yellow and white. Not plan too far ahead. That was what my mother called it when I shipped out for rescue training instead of applying to graduate school. That was what she called it when I missed Thanksgiving because a snowstorm had stranded families in the San Juans. That was what she called it when I came home from Oregon, with smoke still in my hair and hands that would not stop trembling for 2 days. She called it instability. Other people had called it service. Ruth asked, was she good at it? There was a pause. That pause hurt more than the answer. My mother did not say yes. She did not say she had once watched a news clip where my aircraft lifted a stranded family off a flooded highway outside Fort Collins. She did not say she had kept the medal ceremony invitation unopened on the kitchen counter for 4 days before telling me she had a dental appointment and could not come. She said, she survived it. I closed my eyes. The plane stopped at the end of the runway. For a few seconds, everything held still. The cabin, the engines, my breath. Somewhere ahead of me, my mother laughed in that quiet way she used when she wanted a stranger to know she had made peace with having one daughter who worried her. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to say, I did more than survive it. I wanted to say, 11 men went home because I knew how to hold a Black Hawk steady in wind that should have flipped us into the ridge. I wanted to say, you don't get to make my life small just because it scares you. But I had spent years learning the cost of explaining myself to someone committed to misunderstanding me. So I said nothing. The aircraft accelerated. Denver fell away beneath us. My mother's voice faded under the climb, and for a little while, the sky was quiet enough to let me sleep. It would not stay quiet for long. I did sleep. Not peacefully. Not the kind of sleep people imagine when they see a woman curled against an airplane window with a hood pulled low and the cabin lights dimmed. Mine came in pieces at first, broken by the pressure change, the engine vibration, the small metal sounds a plane makes when it climbs through weather. Then exhaustion took over and pulled me under completely. And when it did, I went back to Oregon. 5 years earlier, the sky over Bear Creek had been the color of rust. Not orange, not red. Rust. The kind of color that made the world look old and already burned through. Smoke covered the ridgelines so thick that the sun disappeared before noon, and the airfield where we staged looked less like a base and more like the inside of someone's lungs. I was 27 then, flying with the Army National Guard out of Colorado, rotating through wildfire support missions across 3 states that summer. We had been moving crews, water, supplies, medevac teams, whatever the incident commander needed. Nobody had slept much. Everyone smelled like smoke. Even the coffee tasted like ash. The call came in at 3:18 p.m. 11 firefighters from a hand crew had been cut off in a canyon north of Bear Creek after the wind shifted without warning. Their escape route was gone. Their backup route was gone. The smoke was too heavy for drones. Fixed-wing support could not get low enough to see them. Ground teams were trying to reach them, but the fire was moving faster than men on foot could move uphill. The first voice on the radio was calm because firefighters learn calm the same way pilots do, by using it even when it is no longer natural. We have 11 personnel unaccounted for in Division Charlie. Last known position grid follows. The second voice was not calm. They're in the draw. They're in the draw, and the fire is crowning above them. I remember looking at the map board. I remember the grease pencil circle around the canyon. I remember a captain beside me saying, "No aircraft should go in there." He was not wrong. The smoke column was bending low over the ridgeline. Wind shear was coming off the canyon walls. Visibility was changing by the second. The safe choice was to wait until the fire front moved, or the smoke lifted enough to get a clearer read. But waiting is a decision too. People forget that. Doing nothing still moves the story forward. Sometimes it moves it straight toward a family getting the worst phone call of their life. I asked for their last radio contact. I asked for wind direction. I asked how much fuel we had. Then I walked to my Black Hawk. My crew chief, Ellis Vaughn, looked at me once and did not ask if I was sure. Ellis had flown with me long enough to know the difference between reckless and necessary. He just tightened his gloves and said, "We going low?" I said, "Low enough to matter." The canyon swallowed sound the moment we entered it. Above us, smoke rolled over the ridge like dirty water. Below us, the trees were bending in waves, their tops flashing silver green before the firelight turned them black again. The aircraft shook hard enough that the harness dug into my shoulders. I could not see the firefighters. I could not see much of anything. So I stopped looking for people and started looking for absence. A break in the brush, a shift in the smoke. A place where human beings might have pushed through scrub oak and left a wound in the landscape. Flying rescue teaches you that survivors are rarely where the clean map says they should be. They are where fear, terrain, and bad luck have pushed them. Then, through the static, someone coughed into a radio. "We see a light." Ellis leaned toward the window. "That's us." I lowered the searchlight and swept it across the canyon floor. Not fast. Fast was useless in smoke. I moved it slowly, like a hand feeling along a wall in the dark. The voice came again, weaker this time. "Keep that light there. We can follow that." For the next 9 minutes, I flew a line I could barely see, holding the Black Hawk steady, while wind came at us sideways and the fire climbed the ridge behind them. 9 minutes does not sound long until every second is asking you to quit. 9 minutes is enough time to bargain with God, doubt every choice you have ever made, and still keep both hands exactly where they need to be. One by one, the firefighters emerged below us, gray shapes in orange smoke, moving toward the old service road our light had found for them. Ground crews reached them there. All 11 made it out. Later, one of them got on the radio and said, "Whoever that pilot was, she was the only lantern we had." By the next morning, everyone was calling me Lantern. My mother never asked why. A few hours later, someone else would say that name over a radio loud enough for her to hear. I came out of the memory slowly, the way divers come up from deep water. At first, there was only the engine sound. Low. Constant. Familiar enough that my body accepted it without question. Then there was the shape of the window against my shoulder, the pressure of the seat belt across my lap, the dry airplane air in my throat. I was still asleep enough to believe the smoke was there too, that if I opened my eyes, I would see Oregon burning underneath us. Then the aircraft moved wrong. Not turbulence. Turbulence has a language. It bumps, drops, shivers, rolls through the air in uneven pockets. This was different. This was a hard correction, followed by another correction that did not belong to the first. The left wing dipped. The nose rose too sharply. Then the plane hesitated, as if the sky had briefly stopped holding it. I did not fully wake up. Not yet. In the cockpit, 2 hours of ordinary procedure had already turned into something no checklist wanted to claim. Flight 4827 had been cruising over Utah when the first warning tone sounded. First Officer Hannah Mercer looked up from the flight display at the exact moment Captain Patrick Rowe did. He had the calm of a man who had spent 3 decades making dangerous things feel routine. The first message was simple. Autopilot disconnect. Then came another. Stabilizer triomphalt. Then another. Flight control disagreement. Hannah placed both hands on the yoke. Patrick reached for the checklist. The aircraft pitched down half a degree, then overcorrected upward like something underneath the floor had misunderstood the command. Manual control, Patrick said. I have it, Hannah answered. She did have it. For 3 seconds. Then the yoke pushed back against her in a way that made no sense. Not violently. Worse than violently. Inconsistently. The aircraft was still flying, still responding, but not faithfully. She corrected left. The airplane answered late. She eased the nose down. The trim fought her, then released too much at once. Patrick leaned forward, scanning the displays. That's not a normal trim runaway, he said. His voice was steady. Then it changed. One hand left the checklist and went to his chest. His shoulders tightened. His mouth opened as if he meant to clear his throat, but no sound came out the way it should have. Hannah turned just as his face lost color. Patrick? He tried to answer. What came out was a breath. My arm, he said. Hannah, my left. His head dropped forward against the harness. For 1 second, Hannah Mercer froze. Just one. Then her hand moved. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Transamerican 4827 declaring an emergency. Captain incapacitated. Flight control malfunction. Unable to maintain stable altitude. Her voice shook on the first word. It did not shake on the second. In the cabin, the first real drop came 30 seconds later. A plastic cup lifted off a tray table and hit the floor. Someone gasped. A baby began crying 3 rows behind my mother. Ruth Calder's paperback slid from her lap into the aisle. Overhead bins creaked. Seatbelt signs glowed red above us, like small warnings. Nobody had enough information to understand. My mother gripped both armrests. For once, she was not talking. Then Hannah's announcement came over the cabin speakers, thinner than a captain's voice should have been, but controlled. This is First Officer Mercer. We have an emergency situation on board. If there is any passenger with advanced flight experience, military aviation experience, or flight control systems background, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. The cabin went very quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Recognition, quiet. The kind that happens when strangers understand at the same time that someone in charge has just asked for help. My mother turned her head slightly toward row 7. I know, because Ruth told me later. She looked back just long enough to see my hood pulled low, my face turned toward the window, my body still folded into sleep. Then she looked away. Because even then, even with the aircraft moving wrong under her feet and a pilot asking for military aviation experience, my mother did not think of me as an answer. She thought of me as the daughter who worried her. The daughter who flew helicopters. The daughter who had survived it. Not the daughter who might save them. That was why Neal Donnelly had to be the one to remember my name. Neal Donnelly had been flying long enough to know that panic did not always look like screaming. Sometimes, it looked like a woman folding a napkin into smaller and smaller squares. Sometimes it looked like a man pressing his wedding ring against his lips. Sometimes it looked like an entire cabin going still because every person inside it was waiting for someone else to understand what was happening first. Neal was 56. He had worked medical diversions, engine failures, drunk passengers, smoke in a galley oven, and one landing in Kansas City, where lightning hit close enough to turn every window white. He had learned one rule from all of it. The person who helps is not always the person standing up. After Hannah's announcement, Neal moved down the aisle with one hand on the seatbacks, his shoes braced against the uneven motion of the aircraft. He asked quickly, row by row, keeping his voice low enough not to spread more fear than already existed. Any flight experience? Military? Commercial? Private pilot? Systems engineer? A retired accountant shook his head. A man in a Broncos cap said he had flown Cessnas 20 years ago, then immediately admitted he had not touched a cockpit since 2001. A young woman near row 9 whispered that her father was a pilot, as if blood could transfer training. Neal kept moving. Then, something from pre-flight returned to him. Not a memory exactly. More like a tab left open in the back of his mind. Claire Whitaker, Seat 7C. Aviation Safety Consultant. Colorado Springs. Former Army Aviation. He had noticed it because old Air Force habits never really leave. You read manifests differently when you once learned that the useful person on an aircraft might be a nurse, a mechanic, a firefighter, or someone whose job title sounded harmless until the door came off. Neal reached row 7. Ruth Calder was gripping both armrests now, her paperback on the floor near her shoe. The man in 7A had his eyes closed, and both hands locked together. And beside the window, folded under a faded hoodie, I was still asleep. Neal stared at me for half a second. Later, he told me that was the strangest part. Not the warning lights, not the drop, not the mayday, me. Sleeping through all of it like my body had signed a separate agreement with the world. He touched my shoulder. "Mom?" "Nothing." He shook harder. "Ma'am, I need you to wake up." Still nothing. Ruth leaned across the empty space between us, her voice thin but steady. "That's Claire. Her mother said she flew helicopters." Neal looked toward row 5. My mother was turned halfway around now, pale and rigid, watching him with the expression of someone who wanted to object, but could not find a safe reason. Neal put both hands on my shoulders and shook me with the urgency of a man who no longer cared about politeness. "Claire Whitaker, wake up. I need you awake right now." My eyes opened. For 4 seconds, I did not know where I was. I saw Neal's face above me. I saw Ruth leaning back as if she had just stepped away from a ledge. I saw the seatback screen glowing blue. I smelled coffee, fear, recycled air. Then the aircraft lurched, small but sharp, and the sensation traveled through the seat frame into my spine. That woke me completely. I pulled one headphone away from my neck. "What's happening?" Neal bent closer. "Are you Claire Whitaker?" "Yes." "Are you a pilot?" My throat felt dry. My brain was still dragging itself out of sleep, but the airplane moved again, wrong in the same way a wounded animal moves wrong. "I used to fly Black Hawks," I said. "Why?" His answer came fast. "Because the people flying this plane need help." I unbuckled before he finished the sentence. I was halfway into the aisle when my mother reached for me. Not hard. Not like she meant to stop me by force. Her fingers closed around my sleeve the way they had when I was 8 and stepped too close to a curb, or 16 and said I wanted to enlist, or 27 and came home smelling like smoke, with a voice too tired to explain where I had been. "Claire," she said. I turned. For the first time that night, she looked less like Marlene Whitaker and more like a frightened woman on an airplane that would not fly straight. Her face had gone pale beneath her makeup. One hand was still gripping the armrest. The other held my sleeve. "What are you doing?" Neal stood beside me, one hand braced against the overhead bin, as the aircraft rolled gently and corrected too late. Passengers were watching now. Ruth. The man in 7A. A teenage boy across the aisle with tears standing in his eyes. Everyone seemed to understand that something had shifted, even if they did not know what. "I'm going to the cockpit," I said. My mother's fingers tightened. "But you don't fly these." There it was again. Not cruelty exactly. Limitation. The small box she had built for me, and mistaken for truth. I looked at her hand on my sleeve, then at her face. "You never knew what I flew." Her mouth opened, but no answer came. Before she could find one, The cockpit door opened ahead of us, and a burst of sound spilled into the forward galley. Radios, warning tones. Hannah Mercer's voice, clipped and strained. Another voice, male, coming through an emergency frequency patched loud enough for Neal to hear. Transamerican 4827, Guardian 2, 1 is airborne out of Buckley. We're 12 minutes from visual contact. Confirm again the passenger name. Neal moved forward, pulling me with him. This is cabin-led Donnelly, he said toward the open cockpit. Passenger is Claire Whitaker. Seat 7C, former Army Aviation. The radio went silent. Not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But in an emergency, silence has weight. Then the male voice returned, different now. Sharper. Awake in a new way. Say that name again. Hannah answered this time. Claire Whitaker. She's being brought forward now. Another pause. Then the voice said something I had not heard in years. Lantern? My feet stopped. Behind me, my mother made a small sound. Not a word, just a breath catching in a place that had never made room for that name. The radio crackled again. This is Major Travis Keene, Colorado Army National Guard, Guardian 2-1. If that is Lantern, get her in the cockpit now. She pulled 11 of my people out of Bear Creek when nobody else could see the ground. If anyone on that aircraft understands a broken machine under stress, it's her. The cabin did not understand every word. My mother did. I saw it happen. The way her eyes moved from the cockpit door to me, then to Neal, then back to me again, as if the shape of her own daughter had shifted in front of her. Not because I had changed. Because someone else had finally described me in a language she could not soften. Lantern. 11 people. Nobody else could see the ground. Her hand slipped off my sleeve. Ruth Calder, still seated, looked at my mother with a sadness that was almost gentle. Sounds like your daughter has been steady for a lot of people, she said. My mother did not answer. I stepped into the forward galley. The aircraft shuddered once beneath my feet, and instinct took over where sleep had been. I reached for the wall, steadied myself, and looked back one last time. My mother was staring at me like she wanted to ask 100 questions, and had just realized she had spent 32 years not asking the first one. Claire, she whispered. I held her eyes. I've been helping people from the sky for 12 years, I said. You just never asked what that meant. Then I turned away from her and walked into the cockpit. The cockpit was smaller than I remembered cockpits feeling. Not physically. I had spent years in helicopters where every inch of space had a purpose and every loose object could become a problem. But that night, stepping through the cockpit door of Flight 4827, everything felt compressed. The sound, the light, the smell of sweat and electrical heat. The warning tones stacked on top of one another like alarms in a hospital hallway. Captain Patrick Rowe was slumped in the left seat, restrained by his harness, his chin angled toward his chest. He was breathing, but not well. His skin had gone the color of wet paper. A flight attendant was already kneeling beside him with an emergency oxygen bottle, speaking to him in the calm voice people use when fear has to wait its turn. First Officer Hannah Mercer sat in the right seat with both hands on the yoke. Her hair had come loose from its clip. There was sweat at her temples. Her shoulders were rigid, but her eyes were still moving. Flight display, engine instruments, trim indication, attitude, altitude. Back to the horizon, back to her hands. That mattered. Panic freezes the eyes before it freezes the body. Hannah's eyes were still working. She heard me come in but did not turn. You're Whitaker? Yes. You've flown a 737? No. That made her look at me. Just once. It was not distrust exactly. It was the look of a woman with 184 people behind her and no space left for fantasy. I spoke before she had to. I'm not here to pretend I'm qualified on this aircraft. You fly it. I watch what it's doing. I've flown damaged rotorcraft in bad conditions, and I investigate flight control failures for a living. Tell me what the airplane is actually doing, not what it should be doing. Something in her face changed. Not relief. Not yet. but calculation. She was deciding whether help had arrived or another problem had walked through the door wearing a wrinkled hoodie. The aircraft rolled a few degrees right. Hannah corrected. The response lagged, then came too much. Her jaw tightened. "That," she said, "that's what it's doing." I gripped the back of the observer seat and leaned forward enough to see the instruments without crowding her. The attitude indicator showed the aircraft coming back toward level, but not cleanly. The trim indication twitched in a way I did not like. Airspeed was still usable. Altitude was bleeding, then climbing, then bleeding again in small, ugly waves. "Autopilot disconnected," Hannah said. "Stabilizer trim fault. Flight control disagreement. Manual inputs are inconsistent. Sometimes delayed, sometimes amplified. Pitch is the worst." Captain went down right after the second trim warning. Is the aircraft responding randomly? If it were random, we'd already be gone. I heard my own voice say it before I realized I had spoken. The same thing I had learned in smoke, in wind, in helicopters that came home with warning lights glowing. True chaos kills quickly. If you are still alive, there is a pattern. Your job is to find it before the pattern finds you. Hannah looked at me again. This time, she listened. "Give me a small nose. Down input," I said. "Slow, controlled. Tell me before you do it." "I'm going to push forward slightly." She did. The nose dipped late, then dipped too much. Neutral. She centered the yoke. The aircraft kept responding for half a breath after her hands had stopped asking. "Lag plus overshoot," I said. Again, but smaller. "We don't have room for experiments. We don't have room for guesses either." She took one breath, then another. "Small input," she said. This time I watched her hands, not just the instruments. The yoke moved. The aircraft hesitated, answered, over-answered. "There," I said. "It's not ignoring you. It's late, and then it's trying to make up for being late." Hannah swallowed. "That helps how?" "It means you stop chasing it. You make one correction. Wait for the airplane to finish lying to you. Then correct the correction." For the first time, Hannah's grip loosened by a fraction. The radio crackled. "Flight 4827, Guardian 2-1. We are 7 minutes from visual contact. Lantern. Do you copy?" I reached for the headset Neal had shoved toward me and pressed it against one ear. "Guardian 2-1. Lantern copies. Stay clear until I ask for you. Right now I need quiet, altitude confirmations when available, and someone getting us a 737 systems specialist on this frequency." Major Travis Keene answered without hesitation. "Copy that, Lantern. We're working it." Hannah glanced at me. "They really call you that?" I looked at the trim indication, the altitude tape, her hands. Not because I like attention. The aircraft dipped again. Smaller this time. Hannah did not jerk the yoke. She waited. Let the delayed response finish. Corrected once. The nose came back. Not perfectly, but enough. I leaned closer, keeping my voice level. "That's it. You're still flying the airplane. We just have to teach your instincts a new language before we run out of sky. 7 minutes is not long unless you are waiting for something in the dark." In the cockpit, it stretched. Every second had weight. Hannah flew with both hands on the yoke, no longer fighting the airplane like an enemy, but listening to it like a wounded thing that might still tell the truth if she stopped shouting at it. I watched her inputs, the lag, the overcorrection, the slight shiver in the trim, and kept my voice where fear could not reach it. "Hold that. Don't chase the dip. Let it finish." She did. The aircraft settled, then wandered again. "Small correction. Wait. Now bring it back." On the radio, Salt Lake Center cleared traffic away from us. Another controller spoke in clipped phrases about emergency services, diversion options, weather, runway length. It all mattered, but I kept my eyes on the instruments and Hannah's hands. The world could organize itself outside. Inside this cockpit, we had one job: keep the airplane flying. Then a voice cut through. "Flight 4827, Guardian 2-1, visual contact." Hannah glanced up. I looked through the left cockpit window and saw them. At first, they were only two moving lights against the black, low and steady, closing from behind and slightly below. Then the shapes emerged. UH-60S, Black Hawks. One sliding into position off our left side, the other holding wider on the right, their navigation lights clean and deliberate in the night. For 1 second, I was back over Bear Creek, watching smoke swallow everything except the light we were willing to hold. Guardian 2, 1, Lantern, I said. I have you visual. Major Travis Keene answered, calm and close. Lantern, Guardian 2, 1 is on your left. Guardian 2, 2 is right aft. We are not leaving. Hannah's mouth tightened, but not from fear this time. Something about having another aircraft beside us changed the room. Not the problem. The problem was still ours. The airplane was still damaged. The runway was still somewhere ahead of us in the dark. But we were no longer alone. Use them as a reference, I told Hannah. If the instruments disagree, we verify against them. Not instead of the instruments. With them. Copy, Hannah said. In the cabin, my mother saw the left Black Hawk through the oval window across the aisle. Ruth told me later that Marlene leaned forward slowly. Like if she moved too fast, the sight would vanish. She stared at that aircraft flying beside us, military lights steady in the dark, and for once she had no polished sentence ready. Ruth whispered, "Is that for her?" My mother did not answer, because there was no version of the truth that fit inside the story she had told herself about me. On the radio, Travis spoke again. Lantern, attitude confirms slight right bank. Correcting back now. You're looking better. I repeated it to Hannah. Confirmed slight right bank. Bring her back slow. Hannah did exactly that. The aircraft answered late, but this time she waited for it. Let it finish, corrected once. The wings came level. Not perfectly. Enough. Good, I said. That was good. Hannah exhaled through her nose. I'm starting to feel the delay. That's the airplane teaching you its limp. Outside, the Black Hawks held formation like two dark promises. They could not carry us. They could not fix the system. They could not land the jet. But they could stay. Sometimes that is the first thing a terrified person needs to know. That someone has chosen not to leave. Salt Lake City became the answer, because it was close enough, long enough, and awake enough to receive us. That was how the controller said it, though not in those words. Runway available, emergency crews standing by. Weather acceptable, winds manageable, traffic cleared. The whole system outside our cockpit was rearranging itself around one wounded aircraft and 184 people who had not planned to become a headline before midnight. Hannah heard the clearance and nodded once. Salt Lake, she said, almost to herself. I watched her hands, the way her fingers tightened and loosened on the yoke, the way she was beginning to wait half a breath before correcting, letting the aircraft finish its delayed lie before answering it. She was learning fast because she had no choice, and because good pilots do not become good by never being afraid. They become good by keeping the fear from touching the controls. We're going to make this boring, I said. She gave a short laugh that had no humor in it. This is your version of boring? Boring keeps people alive. A retired 737 systems specialist had been patched into the frequency by then, a man named Carl Brenner, who sounded like he had been pulled from sleep and dropped directly into a nightmare with a headset. He spoke carefully, no wasted words, walking us through possible trim isolation steps, warning us what not to touch, what might make the disagreement worse, what systems were still trustworthy enough to use. The picture became clearer. Not good. Clearer. The aircraft was controllable, but only if Hannah stopped flying the airplane she had trained on and started flying the airplane we actually had. Pitch inputs were delayed and exaggerated. Trim response was unstable below certain corrections. Over-controlling would punish us. Hesitation would punish us too. There was a narrow middle, and we had to stay inside it all the way down. Hannah looked at the approach plate clipped beside her. My concern is the flare. I had already been thinking about it. Everyone in that cockpit had. At altitude, a delayed response was frightening. At 70 feet above a runway, it could be fatal. A normal flare required instinct, timing, muscle memory. But if the aircraft responded late or too much, Hannah's normal landing habit could put the nose where it did not belong. "We test it before we need it," I said. Hannah's eyes flicked toward me. "On approach?" "Before final. Clean enough to recover, low enough to tell us the truth." Carl Brenner came on the line. "That sound. Configure incrementally. Watch pitch response after each change. Do not chase. Repeat. Do not chase." Guardian 2-1 confirmed from the left. "Lantern. Will hold visual references through descent." The Black Hawk stayed with us as we began down through the dark. City lights appeared far ahead, scattered at first, then gathering into a wide glowing basin between mountains. In the cabin behind us, people had stopped asking flight attendants what was happening. That frightened me more than screaming would have. Screaming meant people were still spending fear outward. Silence meant they were saving it for impact. At 8,000 feet, Hannah extended the next stage of flaps. The aircraft dipped. She waited. It rose back, late and heavy. "Good," I said. "Again, it's delayed. Not random." At 6,000, we tested a small pitch input in landing configuration. Hannah moved the yoke with the care of someone touching a bruise. The aircraft hesitated, then answered too much. Her face tightened. "That's going to be ugly in the flare." "Yes," I said. She looked at me. That was not comforting. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be true. For a moment, all I could hear was the breathing in the cockpit. Hannah's, mine, Patrick's shallow oxygen-fed breaths behind us. The distant radio voices. The Black Hawks holding their places in the night. Then I said, "You can do this." Hannah did not answer right away. "You don't know that," she said. "I know you've been flying it for nearly an hour, with a captain down, a broken control response, and a cabin full of people you refuse to lose. I know you're listening now, instead of fighting. I know the airplane still has a pattern. So no, I don't know the future, but I know enough." She stared at the runway lights beginning to form ahead of us. "What do I do at the flare?" I kept my voice even. "At 70 feet, your body is going to tell you to pull the way you always have. You wait for my call. You trust the pattern, not the fear." Hannah nodded once. Outside, Salt Lake kept getting closer. The runway lights stopped looking like a city and became a line. That was when the cockpit changed. Before that, there had been tasks. Checklists, calls, corrections, numbers to read, patterns to watch, instructions to test. Work gives fear somewhere to stand. But on final approach, work narrowed into a single strip of concrete waiting in the dark, and every person in that cockpit understood there would be no second try. Hannah flew. I watched. Guardian 2-1 held left. Guardian 2-2 stayed wide on the right. Their lights hovered in the edges of the windshield like steady stars that had chosen to descend with us. "Flight 4,827, winds 280 at 6, the tower said. "Runway 3-4 left, cleared to land. Emergency vehicles standing by." Hannah's answer was quiet. "Cleared to land, 3-4 left." Her voice did not shake. 1,000 feet. I said. "You're stable enough. Speed is good. Don't chase the small dip." The aircraft sank through the night. The runway grew wider. White lights, red lights. The black shape of pavement between them. Somewhere behind us, 184 people were strapped into seats, hands locked, eyes closed, promises being made silently to God, to spouses, to children, to anyone who might still be listening. In row 5, my mother was holding Ruth Calder's hand. Ruth told me that later. She said my mother was staring toward the front of the aircraft, lips moving without sound. Not praying for Audrey's ceremony, not rehearsing an apology. Just whispering my name, like she had finally realized it belonged to someone she did not know how to lose. 500, I said. Let it settle. Small correction only. Hannah breathed once. Corrected, waited. The airplane answered late, then came back. Good. At 300 feet, the runway filled the windshield. At 200, the yoke trembled under Hannah's hands. At 100, the cockpit became very quiet. Not silent. Airplanes are never silent. But quiet in the human way. No extra words. No wasted breath. "Remember the flare," I said. "I remember. 70 feet. Your body will lie to you. I know. Trust the pattern." 50 feet came fast. Too fast and slow at the same time. "Now," I said. "Forward. Small. Hold it." Every hour Hannah had ever flown told her to pull. Every landing she had ever made lived in her shoulders, her wrists, her spine, screaming against the motion I had just asked for. She pushed forward. The nose dipped just enough. The aircraft responded late, then translated the wrong input into the right outcome. The main gear struck the runway hard enough to punch the breath from my chest. Once. A sharp bounce. Then weight settled. Rubber screamed. The nose gear came down. Spoilers deployed. Reverse thrust roared through the cockpit like a storm breaking open. Hannah kept it centered. "Hold it. Hold it. Don't overcorrect." The centerline lights blurred beneath us. The aircraft shook, fought, slowed, then slowed more. Then, finally, became only a machine rolling on wheels. No one spoke. Not for 1 second. Not for 2. Then Hannah let out a sound that was almost a sob and almost a laugh, and the tower said, "Transamerican, 4827, emergency crews are rolling. Welcome to Salt Lake." I leaned back against the observer seat and closed my eyes. All 184 of us were still alive. Emergency vehicles reached us before the engines had fully wound down. Red lights washed over the cockpit windows. Paramedics came through the door with practiced speed and quiet voices, the kind of quiet that meant they had seen fear before and knew better than to add their own. Patrick was lifted carefully from the captain's seat, oxygen still pressed to his face, one paramedic calling vitals, while another guided the stretcher backward through the narrow space. Hannah did not move for almost a full minute. Her hands stayed on the yoke, even after there was nothing left to fly. Then her fingers opened one by one, as if she had to remind them the job was finished. She turned toward me, and whatever professionalism had carried her down from the sky finally cracked. "You didn't fly it," she said. "No." Her eyes filled. "But you gave me back my hands." I had no answer for that, so I just let her hug me. She held on hard, like the ground still might change its mind. When I stepped out of the aircraft, the cold Salt Lake air hit my face. Passengers stood in uneven clusters near the buses, wrapped in blankets, crying into phones, holding strangers they had not known 2 hours earlier. Ruth Calder saw me first. She pressed one hand to her mouth, then lowered it and nodded once. The way teachers nod when a student has finally shown the room what they knew all along. Beyond the emergency lights, 2 Black Hawk crews stood near the edge of the tarmac. Major Travis Keene stepped forward. He did not smile. Not at first. He came to attention and saluted. "Lantern." The word carried across the pavement. I returned the salute. Only then did I see my mother. Marlene stood a few steps behind Ruth, her cashmere sweater wrinkled, her makeup pale under the flashing lights. She looked smaller than she had in Denver. Not weaker, just stripped of the polished version she knew how to wear. "Claire," she said, "I'm proud of you. For years, I had imagined those words, saving something in me. They did not. They mattered. But they did not erase the unopened invitation, the careful corrections, the way she had made my life sound temporary to strangers. I needed that when I came home from Oregon," I said. "I needed it when you told people I was still finding myself." Her lips trembled. "I didn't know." I looked at her, tired down to the bone. "You didn't ask." Ruth touched my mother's arm gently. "Some children don't need to be bragged about," she said. "They just need to be seen." That night, I did not fly to Seattle. I slept in a hotel near the airport with the lantern patch on the table beside me. My mother had spent years looking down on me because she never understood the sky. But that night, the sky called my name loud enough for her to hear. The lesson I took from that night is not that every person is secretly a hero waiting for the right emergency. Real life is not that simple. Most of us will never be woken up on a damaged aircraft. Most of us will never hear helicopters outside the window or a voice on the radio calling our name. But all of us know what it feels like to be misunderstood by someone whose approval once meant everything. Sometimes the deepest wounds in a family do not come from shouting. They come from being reduced. From having your work called a phase, your pain called drama, your courage called recklessness, your path called unstable, simply because it does not look like the life someone else would have chosen for you. Claire did not become valuable the night the Black Hawks called her name. She was already valuable when she came home from Oregon with smoke in her hair. She was already valuable when she kept flying rescue missions no one at her family table wanted to understand. She was already valuable when her mother made her sound small to strangers. The emergency did not create her worth. It only revealed it. And maybe that is the part we should carry with us. Do not wait for a crisis to recognize the people you love. Ask about their lives while there is still time. Listen before the world has to prove them right, in a way that hurts. A child should not have to save a plane, win an award, make a fortune, or survive a disaster before a parent finally says, "I see you." At the same time, if you are the one who has been overlooked, remember this. Being unseen does not mean being empty. Being underestimated does not mean being unworthy. Keep building your skill. Keep carrying your light. Keep becoming the person you know you are, even if the people closest to you are the last to understand it. Sometimes healing begins with an apology. Sometimes it begins with a boundary. And sometimes it begins with realizing you no longer need to shrink your life so someone else can feel comfortable misunderstanding it. What did you take from Claire's story? Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next one.